So welcome everyone. Korey is a fractional CTO, CIO, and strategic advisor who specializes in something most companies don't even realize is costing them, and that's leadership misalignment. Um, I'm personally very interested in this because I feel all of the large elephants, IBMs, the Blackberries of the world, uh, fell off where they were because of emotional disengagement of the leadership. I'll stop there, and with that, all yours, sir.
I appreciate that. That's exactly right. So, as Manan said, I am Korey Mercier, and I specialize in herding wolves. I really appreciate you all coming to my talk, and what I'm really hoping is that this will allow us to have a longer conversation afterwards, where I can hear all of your war stories and learn some things from you as well. So I'm not here really to talk about misalignment per se. You all know it's a problem. What I'm hoping you get out of this talk is a reframing of how to approach misalignment within particularly the product and engineering relationship. But there are always other aspects to that conversation and some ideas on how to resolve that. So, just to give you a little bit of an understanding, here's an example from many years ago. I was working with a small engineering team, relatively new, very senior engineer leading the team, wasn't as business focused, very much focused on making sure that his engineers had what they needed. Had a product manager who had been brought in to help drive the team forward, and they were working on a product launch. So the product was essentially for the energy sector, working with industrial control systems. It was an inventory management system and had a lot of moving parts, had a partner, technology partner that was involved in actually doing the inventory identification process. And the engineering team was doing its thing. It was building the product. They thought that they were meeting their deadlines, but senior leadership was not happy because the product manager could never get an actual deadline out of these people and and the engineering team didn't understand that the deadlines mattered. So the product manager was trying to get a launch together. So they actually had a conference that was coming up, and the product was nowhere near ready. And the engineers were focused on things like elastic scaling and some of these issues, and they were running into scaling problems. And every time you ask the engineers what the issue was, their response was always the same. This is a discovery process. We don't know how long things are going to take. Meanwhile, we had a salesperson that was going and talking to prospective clients and coming up with product features and deadlines and timelines that were not based on reality, had not been vetted. And so we had a distinct misalignment between all of these different parties. And so the CTO brought me in to help mediate between all the parties and try and get things moving together. And of course, where I spent most of my time was in understanding the context from each of these parties' perspectives. So, what does product think is going on? What does the engineering manager think was going on? I actually spent time attending meetings with prospective clients with the sales lead to understand what he thought the product was and when it would be ready and all those kinds of things. So it was a lot of effort, and I learned a lot from that engagement that I'd like to kind of go through here. Some of my learnings from that. So most people think of it as mediation, as you go in there and you just tell people where they're wrong and make sure that they understand each other's sides of the view. Well, that's true to an extent, but that's treating the symptoms. The actual problem is structural, and that means that you end up paying for this structural misalignment in terms of what I like to look at as a tax. It's invisible. You don't understand the costs while you're in it. It's recurring every single sprint. You're falling further behind. You're having to deal with misunderstandings of what those priorities were, and those priorities would shift from sprint to sprint. And it would compound because as this went on, sprint after sprint, you had leadership was getting more irritated, product was getting more frustrated. Engineering just didn't like being told that everything they were working on was the wrong priority because they had a distinct vision for how things were moving forward. And so this compounds over time, and it drives a lack of trust between the individual parties involved. So one of the things you have to understand when you're going through this process, when you encounter a situation like this, especially as fractionals, when you walk in, it's almost never that there are bad people. Occasionally, you'll have people that are lacking in certain experience, but the issue is usually that we're talking about different groups of individuals with different experiences, different understanding of how a product should be launched. They're speaking different languages to each other, and they're measuring progress in different ways. They're on different clocks. So the product manager is looking for launch dates and release timelines. The engineering team is looking for uh, a health of the system because they're going to have to maintain this for multiple years. And so often there is no translation layer, and that's where often I would say you all are being brought in as fractional CTOs, CPOs to help resolve that translation layer. So one of the things that you'll realize is that this tax shows up in multiple ways. You've got throughput issues. So you have technical debt, you have changes in priorities that are going to have the engineering team working on things that the product manager doesn't really want them working on, which leads to consistent misunderstanding. So you go into a sprint retrospective and you realize that everything that we committed to is not quite what we were getting done because we encountered some problems along the way. And so, in the age of AI, you can write code fast as anything, but that may not be the right code. And so, we're getting into this trend where we can just throw away code and rewrite it. It's okay. Now, many years ago, that wasn't quite the situation. You wrote code, it was a real problem because that was time, serious time lost. And so at least that part is getting a little bit better. But what you end up with is all of these branches that make it into the production code that doesn't really belong there. And all of this frustration builds into a lack of engagement. And so what you end up with is a feeling of psychological safety lost. And that is the most expensive part of this process because when you lose trust between these individuals, between product and engineering and sales and senior leadership, that trust is really hard to get back. And every sprint that compounds until your best people will consider leaving because they give up. They're going, I know that this is an important part of this project, and I'm not being heard. And so, they'll leave the team or they'll disengage. And that may be a critical person on the team that the rest of the team is relying on. The product manager is struggling because, in this case, she felt like she had no um, ability to change the minds of the engineering people because the engineering manager was representing the engineering interests and was talking about constraints. And so that trust, that lack of trust was very, very difficult to get back. That's why they ultimately brought me in to try and help solve this situation. But what you have to really understand here is that your job is not mediating, it's not refereeing, it's not just stepping in between people who are quabbling. Your job is to actually translate why the engineering team feels the way that they do, why the product manager has such a commitment to these timelines, why those timelines matter. And the relationships that are breaking down inside the company extend out. Sometimes you have potential clients, you have partners that you're working with that are starting to feel this concern, this pressure, because they are not having their promises kept. So the thing to understand here is that the solution is to develop a shared context between all these parties. There's a lot of get people in the room and let's discuss what are the actual constraints. Why are these timelines important? Why sales can't make promises that engineering hasn't vetted? Why Elasticsearch was important in this particular case. And to also acknowledge that the CTO's job is to drive products and sales. They don't just serve the technology side of the business. They actually serve the business by driving those. You cannot solve all of these problems. What you can do is make them smaller and you can make them visible. You can make people talk about it so that you improve the communications across all of these parties. So where you see that this is getting better, these are some of the symptoms that you'll see that things are actually improving. So priorities surviving contact with a sprint. Roadmap reviews feeling less like a battle zone, like you're in heated negotiations. When the engineering team says, no, we can't do that, there's an actual conversation involved. There's a trade-off. We can't do it this way because that, or we can do it this way, but this is what you're losing. This is what the trade-off will be for that. But the biggest one, in my opinion, on this list is that disagreements start happening in the room and not in DMs, because what happens in conversation or in relationships like this between parties very often is everyone will start agreeing in the room. Oh yeah, we can do that, no problem. And then the DMs start, right? They get on, the engineers get on Slack, or the product manager calls the CTO and makes promises that the engineers just agreed to, that now the engineers are going, that really isn't going to work. So all of those hidden conversations, those will start to reduce when people are starting to speak openly in the room. So trying to hit my 10 minutes here. Uh, what I have here is a list of questions to start our conversation. Where do you first spot the tax in a new client? So again, I'm coming from a perspective as you're walking into a team that's already underway. They've already got relationships established, and you are the new person that's walking in going, all right, how do I understand where those gaps are, where those taxes are? And so I want to hear from you all. What are the alignment issues that you have seen and the most expensive taxes you've seen a company pay? Where is that line between mediation and translation? Because there is a point where you have to stop treating the symptoms of that conversation and start moving toward, let's develop some shared context. Let's improve our structural process, which might mean having a different way of viewing the metrics that everyone is measuring things by so that we're all on the same page. And then how do you make sure that alignment will outlast you if you are in there temporarily? So I've got a couple of QR codes on this slide, one to my LinkedIn and one to my homepage. And I would love to hear all of you what you have seen in your businesses and your engagements.
Thank you so much, Corey. I think this is, if you could stop sharing your screen for a picture.
I can do that.
So I think this is a very important discussion that we need to perhaps have repeatedly, and sort of like every couple has its issues, every team has its issues. So would love to open this out to Q&A. Um, who wants to go first?
Hey,
No
Corey,
one then.
I can go
Okay.
first. Corey,
Okay.
what I have seen is that this is such a real problem, right? Not only as a fractional, but even in my prior roles leading teams, like you said, it's a tax, it's a hidden tax, and it holds a lot of folks back. I think where I've seen this surface, though people don't really recognize this initially, is at the very beginning of the project of having clarity as to what needs to happen. You
Hmm.
generally start off and people make commitments or have expectations, and then they haven't really thought through things, right? So the product team's kind of having some idea, and they're like, oh yeah, we'll this honestly it happens at the very beginning, but where you feel it is when the rubber hits the road, because
Yeah.
all those assumptions that were not tested can tend to get that tension going when you get a deadline or you have a customer, and then now you're looking at stuff and said, well, I thought I was building a box, though I really wanted a circle, and all of those things kind of come into play, and then it's that lack of clarity, and then also the lack of understanding of the challenges the different disciplines have in that collective mission or goal, right? Engineers many times don't want to go redo work. Product folks think that it's super easy to build something, and so you have this very interesting dynamic. And that's what I've seen. And so I see that it's really uh, I see it start at the very beginning, but not many people really think about it or even notice that.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. The product manager absolutely has a huge role in this in making sure that the vision that she has, the vision that the leadership team has, the vision of what the sales team thinks they're selling is crystal clear. I completely agree. It's that the conversation does require both
No.
sides to explain their sides. Yeah, I was going to say that both products and engineering in this case have an absolute need to communicate their sides of the issue, and the engineers often aren't able to communicate the constraints that they're under in a way that product understands it. And that's where part of the problem is. Their incentives are different. Their communication styles are different. The words they use are different. The way they measure themselves are different.
Yeah, and I also think it kind of it gets more depending on the leader. You see, you can have the at the very top, you can have a leader who is either inclined more on the product side, inclined more on the tech, or who has the right balance. Usually, when you have a leader who has the right balance, they tend to drive all the different divisions or groups towards that common goal better than
Hmm.
if you have somebody who had come from the product side, or who had come from the tech side, or who had come from the operation side. And then, that thinking, there's always that one, a bias towards a certain aspect, and that this tax tends to grow.
Completely agree.
I would I I wonder if it's really about just the leader being product or sales or being biased towards something else. And I think this is a universal problem. And as I said, every couple has it, every set of parents and kids have it. And I
Hmm.
think the fact that we need to understand this is sort of like cleaning the kitchen. Dishes need to get done every day. And if you do not have a cadence around that, and Korey, thank you. I'm realizing I need to do this more at my team too. And I think this is such a big problem. This is why the large companies lose out. I was at a course last year at Stanford with a bunch of executives, and we had these organizational behavior gurus, and I asked them, like, all of these large companies that died out, it's not like they didn't have enough money to hire McKinsey, they didn't have enough money to hire the top university professors, PhDs,
Sure.
and it's not like they weren't super smart to begin with themselves. I I'm curious, like I feel like there's a huge emotional angle to this, despite all of us having different ways of communicating and different incentives, where once that emotional disengagement starts, Corey, what you said around compliance starts,
Hmm.
I feel like when people start getting disengaged, whether that's in a couple, in a family, or in a team, um, that's when the leadership doesn't have a full idea because they're just like, yeah, who cares? I don't care. Let him do or let her do what. Can you speak a little bit more about that also? Like, is it really just the incentives? I've seen emotions weigh in so much. And I feel like that's a discussion we again don't bring to the room. It's like, oh yeah, emotions are parked at the door when we enter this building. Nope, doesn't happen.
No, emotions are everything. I think you're spot on. The reason I gave psychological safety and lack of trust and that topic its own slide was for exactly that reason. It is what it's all about. Because the why I was reading a little bit of Michael's comment over there. The why things happen is because they have different incentives, different timelines, different language, different ways of communicating what's important to them. But the end result is a communication that lacks clarity, that lacks transparency. You end up with people who get so frustrated by either not being understood or by feeling like they're repeating themselves over and over again, that it reduces the trust they have in the people that they're working with to hear them recognize their value, their worth. They want to feel that they're on a team where that recognizes their worth. And so when they run into that frustration, That frustration causes them to disengage. That disengagement causes them to um, not go above and beyond, to not push for something that they know is important. Maybe the engineers really were onto something saying, hey, that if we don't nail this scaling problem, the entire application is going to fall apart. And this is our product. This is our reputation on the line. They don't want that. And the product, manager may go, my customer doesn't care about elastic scaling, right? They care about a product that will come in and do a good job of inventorying their hardware and letting them know when there are patches available and all of those. They care about the product features. So they're talking past each other, and that leads to a lack of trust and engagement. And that once that starts, that compounds, and that makes it very, very difficult for uh, any of the parties involved to get what they want out of that relationship.
I'm going to hand the mic to Yin, and maybe we need a part two where you share some of your magic sauce or stardust around what you do, frameworks, get people more interested. Yes, Yin,
Sure.
over to you.
Sure. So I was just going to say, I really love the analogy of speaking different languages and not understanding each other because as a bilingual speaker myself, language isn't just language, right? Language
Right.
comes with culture and expectations of how you actually say certain things because it means different things, right? So I
Hmm.
feel like this problem that we're talking about, it's it's being it's being like magnified now that AI can allow product people who are typically not in the build process to make things. But this
Right.
is where I feel like I'm understanding this misalignment more and more and appreciating the fact that we all just need to take the time to understand how we actually need to communicate with each other and then what is the impact of what we do front of the house, if we're thinking about a restaurant, front of the
Hmm.
house versus like back of the house, both
Yes.
of which needs to understand the customer, right? Just from a
Yep.
different vantage point. And the challenge that I have is most of the product teams are focused on the business. They haven't taken the time, and I'm not saying this is everyone, but my experience has been some of the good product leaders haven't spent a lot of time getting to understand how things get done. Now that you've done some vibe coding, I'm sure most of us have done some vibe coding, you understand the tax that comes when you make a change on your requirements, right?
Right.
Right? So like when you try to go to the perfect and you build the full application, oh God, you forgot a module. Now you have to make a change. Okay, what happens on the back end of the code? Are you refactoring the code or are you actually rewriting the code altogether? So I feel like
Right.
if you didn't have that kind of appreciation and investment up front to understand how decisions get executed and have and I'm being a little bit mean on the product side because I'm primarily on the product side. I'm being a little bit mean to the product people, which is like the advice I give to the product team is like, you have got to have an understanding of how the technology works, how your
Yep.
decisions actually impact the engineering team. It's not like they're trying to be a pain in the butt with you. They're just trying to
Right.
minimize the level that you need to keep up with how the business needs to change. So I would say totally agree. I love the description of it being a tax because again, being a dork, I'm talking like vectors. So like when you have
Of
misalignment, it's
course.
like wasted energy, sorry. Right? So it's like
Yeah.
wasted energy and then wasted
Yeah.
energy from a business standpoint is tax, right? You're paying extra effort that you could have spent on executing. So sorry, I know that was like a ton, but thank you. I totally resonate with what you're talking about and the advice that I typically give to my customer is like you guys got to understand how your actions impact each other. Spend a
Yes.
day, understand, follow the lead. Like, how did this thing gets translated? Understand the underlying technology. Like, I'm actually on the opposite side when you said, "Oh, you shouldn't have to worry about Elasticsearch." In my business, I do highly regulated SaaS. Single sign
Okay. Yeah. So you get it.
Single sign-on it's a big
Yeah.
deal, right? Because like you need to understand as a business leader how you should best approach single sign-on, right?
Hmm.
So, and again, a lot of the business leaders would be like, "Oh, that's a technical decision, like we have like CISOs
Right.
and da 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 da." I'm like, not if you're selling B2B SaaS. Do you understand how
Correct.
they need you to show up in terms of single sign-on? What is the requirement that they have? And so, anyway, so I'm going to stop, but thank you. It's nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. No, that was wonderful. And I think your analogy that you started with on the language is spot on. And there's a translation. And you mentioned being bilingual. There's a translation that goes on in your head. And that's what both sides of this conversation needs to do. The business person needs to think about things from a technical side. Why are the engineers considering these things to be important? Why would my customers care about some of these things that the engineers are telling me about? That translation is critical. And you mentioned the restaurant analogy. Love that. Front of the house, back of the house. How do they succeed at both serving the customer? They've built a system. Their communication. They know, oh, this table has a food allergy. That's critically important information. So they have a method for doing that. They don't just pass the buck through the window. Used to be that people would talk about doing something and then throwing it over the wall to the other team and how bad that is. Well, the reason that's bad is because the communication's not actually happening. You need that window to be able to pass those messages and those communications so that each side receives them properly, not just that you're sending them, but that each side receives them. So I love that.
Thank you
I
so
wanted to
much.
jump in.
Michael, yours is the last question, and no,
Oh,
can we go on for another minute with all of you? Is that okay?
Yes.
So Michael's last question, and then we'll
yeah, no,
try to wrap.
I think that's a good place to end, is where I think, my big takeaway on this problem is, as I mentioned in the chat, it feels universal. It feels very much every organization I've ever been a part of has some degree of this tax. Some are fatally toxic and some are mild, but they're all there. The
Right.
question about what we do about it is important. And I think the question of where it originates is even more important. And just to put one little sort of thought on the table here, when we speak to each other across disciplines, the terms that we use often carry with them inherent assumptions about status. So one of the things, it's a little pet peeve of mine, but everyone that I know of, almost everyone, uses the term technical and non-technical. I am
Right.
non-technical, right? A lot of business people will say that, and they will say that proudly. I am non-technical. And implicit in that self-own, if you will, is that it is not important for me to be technical because I'm non-technical, and that's okay. And that's it. Now, a technical person who prides themselves identity-wise on being technical hears that and says, what do you think, my fucking role of being technical is not important enough for you? That's an implicit thing. Now, people use that language all the time, and it grates on people from two different directions. Technical people use that same definition. Well, you're not technical. As a status indicator, which means that your product manager or your business person or your salesperson, the other people who you need to trust, are somehow beneath you on a status hierarchy. Same thing applies to your business, non-business, your sales, your customer facing, your not customer facing. These ways we use of describing each other carry these implicit sort of microaggressions, to use that woke term, but it's real.
Yes.
And it
100%.
manifests. And so my big question is, in my experience of having to iron this out, establishing trust between these groups starts with calling that out and saying, don't use those damn terms, guys. You got to understand that when you use that completely innocently, you're really pissing someone else off and eroding the very trust that we all agree is important here. So I'll just throw that out there as an observation. What do you think, Korey?
And I think that's absolutely a fantastic observation. I completely agree. And that's actually a whole different talk that I find myself giving a lot
All right, good.
on bias. And there's another one in there on power dynamics. But the bias that you're calling out, the connotations, the words that people use, those connotations. So I mentioned this earlier about the restaurant. Communication is not I'm being clear with my words. Communication is I am using my words in a way that they can be heard and understood in the way I intended, right? So there's three parts to communication. There's the sender's message, there's how it's being received, and there's the medium that you're communicating through, right? Because I think we can all agree that text messages and email have a very different, conversation than if you're on the phone. That's why, a lot of those conversations end up moving to DMs and Slack messages when the engineers start actually talking about what they feel. But you're 100% right. The biases between the parties, it's not just the words they speak, but it's their background and it's the words that they use for the other people involved in that conversation. It is something that if you are brought in to do that translation, remember I said it's not about mediation, it's about translation. Mediation is important. I'm a formally trained mediator, but it treats the symptom. It calms the environment. But then what you actually need to do is come together and have a shared taxonomy, right? A shared verbiage, language that you're using. I don't know that it's necessarily the best approach to come in and say, don't use those damn terms, just because I think that that's going to have people that are going to lose trust in you. But effectively, that's the conversation you need to have. It's let's have awareness. Let's have clarity around what terms we're using and what that impact has toward a perception of a status hierarchy, which adds to the strain and adds to the distrust and the disrespect.
Well said.
Thank you so much, Korey, and everyone. Sorry we ran a little above. I think
I'm
there's a
fine with
part
it. I
two to this.
appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Yeah,
This
no,
was
great
a,
I just make
Korey.
sure that
Thank
we
you for calling
always
it out.
end on time. I think that's more
this
important
was a
than
great
starting.
conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Let's
Korey.
have a
My
follow-up
pleasure.
on this.
I look
Bye.
forward to talking with all of you. Please communicate independently if it's of interest.
Yeah,
All right,
likewise.
we'll be
Will
paying
do.
you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.